Hi there, and welcome to the remote onboarding and orientation session. My name is Nick Thornton. I'm a career educator with Workplace Learning. Before we dive into this presentation, I just want to acknowledge that I'm recording today on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. And I think it's important for all of us to acknowledge, regardless of where we're working, acknowledging where we are working. So remote onboarding and orientation is a large topic, but I'm hoping that we've taken together some feedback that we've heard from supervisors and students and made it something that's helpful and applicable to you. So a quick overview of what I'll cover in this session. I'll talk about the differences between onboarding and orientation. I'll also introduce you to a framework called the 4 C's of onboarding. We'll take a little bit of inventory and I'll ask some questions for you to think about the training pieces that you already have in place. And then I'll talk about some of the different components of training, which includes online training, the platforms and best practices that go along with that, as well as some of the challenges of onboarding remotely. So in terms of difference between orientation and onboarding, I think it's helpful to make a distinction between the two so that we know that these are two different activities that are happening often at two different times. So I really think about orientation as the first day or two of a job. Often this can be before somebody formally starts a position, but we're used to in terms of an all-day training session or maybe a couple of days of training that are where an employee is going to learn the written rules and the basics of a position. Usually orientation is some kind of event. It's usually held in a classroom or a meeting room, and the focus is on the integration into the unit and the specific job itself. Obviously, in terms of remote work, this might look very different. And so it's likely going to be something that is spread out over time and more of an onboarding process versus an orientation. So for onboarding, this is learning both the written and the unwritten rules. And it's usually a process or a series of events and something that happens on the job. So on the job remotely is obviously going to be happening in somebody's home or their preferred workplace, but is going to be something that is ongoing and includes professional development and career conversations. So orientation is something that's happening to get somebody kind of with their feet in the door to a position and understanding the basics. Onboarding is something that happens continuously that's helping a student or anybody feel acclimatized and ready for their role. So the 4 C's of onboarding is, I think, a helpful framework just to make sure that we're considering the various elements that go into onboarding and orientation. The first one is compliance. And compliance here doesn't just mean following rules, but is all about the basic legal and policy related regulations of your unit and department. So often this is including paperwork, department specific access if somebody needs a swipe card in order to get into a certain area, making sure that those things are set up. In terms of remote work, compliance is going to have to do more with access to technology. So if there's shared drives, shared folders, clarification ensures that employees understand their position and what the related expectations are. So clarification is something that is also ongoing, but is really important at the beginning of the onboarding process to check and make sure that your student employee understands what it is they need to do and how to do that. In terms of culture, this provides employees with a sense of the formal and informal norms of your unit, your department, or your team. This is a challenge in the remote context, and it's something that often is being seen through example, and we pick up when we're in the workplace. But when we're all working from home, this is a much more difficult thing to actually get across. And I'll talk more about how we can do that in a moment. And lastly, there's connection. So this is establishing interpersonal relationships and information networks through the experiences on the job and communicating with different people in the role. Connection is a really important reason why students take jobs and work with people like you. And so any point that you can create where they can connect with you, with your colleagues, with their colleagues, is an opportunity for them to feel increasingly connected to the role, but also feel like they're a part of the team. For our purposes here, I'll leave you with these questions to think about as your starting point. It's really easy to go down the route of all the things you don't have or the grand plans about the perfect training and onboarding plan. But I think it's really important to start with what we actually have and make sure that all of that information, all of those techniques and those various training modules, wherever we've used them in the past, are collected into one area so that if nothing else, we always have a starting point. This is an example of an orientation checklist I highly recommend, regardless of how you're doing your remote onboarding and orientation, to have some sort of checklist available for both you and your students to follow through and see, have they actually completed all of the things that they need in order to do their job. So these are some tips that I think provide a good foundation when we think about supervising remotely and doing training during that. Establishing regular structured check-ins. Many of us will have already been doing this, but this might need to increase in structure and in terms of frequency. So if you're somebody that's been meeting in the past with your student employees once every 2 weeks, you may consider going to weekly because you're not going to have as many points to just bump into each other and ask questions or check in and see how things are going. Also make sure you're providing several different communication methods and be clear when to use which method. If you prefer everything just gets funneled through email or Slack, great. Just make sure students know which platform to use and when. Also provide opportunities for remote social interaction. Now, this is a difficult one because everybody's online all the time now, and we do want to be mindful of not pushing people into further online burnout. But I think it's important to think about ways in which we're including people in our team, even in the remote workspace. So rather than just waiting for our check-ins to have our conversations, having structured moments throughout the work week or in any given month where there's opportunities to connect with each other, connect with other students who might be working in the role, or just connect with other folks in the unit. Obviously, we're not seeing as much of the students in person and their work, and so offering encouragement is something that needs to be maybe more intentional and scaffolded into the role. And what I mean by that is making sure that in your check-ins, you're taking time to offer encouragement and let people know what it is they're doing well. And the same goes for making sure you're getting feedback and giving feedback to your students, is making sure that there's some structured way of this happening and not just assuming that it will happen organically, because it may not in the remote environment. So let's talk about some of the online training platforms. This list is by no means exhaustive, but it's a rough overview of some of the things available at UBC. So Canvas is a great UBC licensed software that allows students to access course content, and you can also build training modules on Canvas that would look and feel very much like a course. Obviously, this has some disadvantages because students are already working a lot on Canvas, might be getting a little bit tired of that platform. However, it does offer a lot of flexibility, and it's a platform that students already use and is supported by UBC. UBC Blogs is another great resource. It operates on a WordPress platform, but you can close it to a select group of users, so you can have like a private blog for just your work team. And again, it offers a way to lay out material, create modules in much the same way you would on Canvas, but with a little bit more flexibility about the layout and design. If you're wanting to track large amounts of information and have like a database that students can search, I'd highly recommend looking at the UBC Wiki. This operates very much like Wikipedia, except it's hosted on UBC platforms and you need a CWL to log in. If you have a lot of policies or training that requires reading and heavy documentation, I'd really recommend looking at a wiki because it's something that your student employees can also contribute to. So it's something that you can use and build over time. Of course, you can use WordPress or other content management systems to create something entirely from scratch to suit your preferences. I'm always a fan of using things in-house that are relatively simple to use, and also I know there are people who can support me if I run into any issues. So a quick overview of some best practices to encourage when working remotely. First of all, clearly communicate guidelines and expectations for working remotely. This isn't something everyone will have experience with, and even if a student has been working on coursework previously and is maybe used to doing things remotely, working in your particular context, in your area on those projects that you're working on might look really different and might have a different way of doing things, a different way of communicating. I think it's also really important to offer a clear system for tracking and managing work that's shared with both you and your student employees. So this could be done on a Google Doc, it could be done on a document in a shared drive, as long as somewhere you both can see what projects are getting worked on and with some timelines attached to those. Now, we're somewhat limited in what we can personally offer in terms of providing reliable technology and resources, but I do think it's really important to check in with your student employees about the technology and resources that they're using to see if there's anything where they might need some more support. Ensuring leadership visibility and communication. I know for me, when I was supervising, I relied a lot on being able to walk past a service desk and having students come in and out of my office and just physically be in the same space, sharing information and ideas. It's much harder when you're in meetings a lot of the day and you are physically not in the same workspace as your students. So I'd really encourage finding some way to let your students know when you're available and get used to checking in with you, that you may not be available at all times. And that might be true for them as well. But making sure that you're available and a student knows when you're available so that they can come to you with questions or ideas. And lastly, we've talked about this a little bit already, but considering new ways to unify your team. So going outside of the box and getting creative with ways that you can work well with your student employee, but also build some team culture as well. That could be as simple as just adding a fun question to the beginning of each of your check-ins. That could be maybe allowing students to chair your team meetings on a rotating basis, but finding new ways to keep people engaged and making sure that as much as possible, we have some good routine, but also we're keeping things fresh. So some challenges of remote work. We're all facing challenges in the workplace, and I will talk first about the challenges and then about some of the solutions to these challenges. So a big one is that timelines are disrupted and unpredictable. I think it's fair to say at this point, most of us have encountered some point in our work where our work has been dramatically disrupted, or we're not able to predict what is coming next. There's also the challenge of having limited contact with mentors and peers. So we know students are taking these jobs because they want to work with people like you and other professionals. However, they're going to have somewhat limited contact if they're working remotely. So thinking about ways that we can still have that as a part of the role. Students learn asynchronously, so they're learning at different times and at different speeds. So what works for one student employee may not work for another, and you're going to have people learning material and getting acclimatized to the job at different times and at different speeds. And that's something that's really important to acknowledge. It's also important to acknowledge that the ability for students to process information may be much lower at times. There's a litany of things that we're all facing, but students in particular are coming from their own contexts. They may have been out of Canada for the summer or for the academic term and coming back. And so they've had to deal with things previous to coming to this job. And it's important to recognize that not everybody is coming in at 100% ready to go and ready to hit the ground running. Obviously, that's our ideal state, but I think it's important to acknowledge the reality under which we're all living. Some solutions to these challenges. When timelines are disrupted and unpredictable, I think it's important to establish clearly defined times during the day, and ideally in different places in our homes, to separate our work and our personal life. So this is something you can do for yourself, but also encourage your student employees to be thinking about. Of course, everybody's limited by their own living situations, but I highly encourage at least a conversation around how are you separating your work and personal life? How are you making sure that when your shift is done or your work on a project is done, that you're able to transition from that work and move into something else? In terms of limited contact with mentors and peers, I go back to the establishing regular check-ins for students to connect with you, but also with each other. So if you are supervising multiple students, or you're supervising one student, but you have colleagues who are also supervising students, finding ways for those folks to connect with each other, to build some camaraderie and find connections in the workplace that they're not going to be able to have as easily as over a informal lunch in person. So in terms of students learning asynchronously, that is at different times and different speeds, I'd really focus on think about your theory first. What are the things that a person needs to know, the theories and the practices that underpin all of the work that you do in your unit, in your field? Then focus on shifting into the window of application. So that means looking at taking the theory, taking the things that a student has read or watched or observed, and then actually applying those in the workplace. Because some folks are going to be able to hit the ground running, and other people are going to need some clarification, maybe additional training, and maybe additional support to reach your ideal level of being able to do the job. In terms of cognitive load being much lower at times, I think it's really important to, as I said before, just recognize reality and have conversations with your student employees about what is feasible. Anticipate challenges when you can, and also when to communicate. So I think something that's very common for students is trying to solve a problem on your own first. And in the remote context, that's maybe not always the best idea, because it might be faster to reach out and ask somebody for clarification or help than to spend a week waiting until your next check-in trying to solve a problem yourself. Lastly, I'd also really encourage students to take screen breaks. I'd encourage you to do that as well, but especially for student employees, making sure that they are taking time away from the computer to open up different parts of their brain, but also to take a break from something they're going to be looking at a lot. If you would like some additional support or to talk to somebody about your onboarding and orientation plan or anything related to supervising, reach out to our office at work.learn@ubc.ca. If you're not already familiar with the faculty and staff resources page for WorkLearn, we encourage you to go there. The link is also in the video description. And this is the place where we include all the important timelines around WorkLearn, but also importantly, we have a whole host of resources for supervisors. So any workshops or webinars that are happening are posted here, and then we have resources for these different sections. So I want to thank you very much for the time that you've taken today to listen to me talk about these things. I encourage you to reach out to your colleagues who are also supervising students to hear about the things that they're trying and the things that they've found have worked really well, and maybe some things to avoid. And of course, as always, do reach out to the WorkLearn office if there's anything at all that we can help with. And I wish you the very best of luck in supervising remotely this term.